So it's a very, very relevant topic that we would like to address today. With more than 28,000 registered water users that's using groundwater on the departmental database of the Department of Water and Sanitation, the WARMS database, we can actually see that groundwater is very, very important, and it's just rising on that. With the 3 billion cubes that is still available to be allocated, the race is really on so that everybody can take their little share. But with this, there's a lot of challenges and there's frustration, not just on the applicant side, but also on the groundwater specialist and the regulator. And that's precisely what we would like to address today. So I would give over to our Professor Matthys Dippenaar as President of the IAH South Africa, take us a bit through give us a little bit more background, take us through the program, and also introduce our panel that we've compiled for today. Matthys, over to you.
Thank you, Fanus, and welcome everyone. I'm the current president of the International Association of Hydrogeologists South Africa Network and the past chair of the Groundwater Division. So it's a really wonderful collaboration that we have here today. We've had quite a number of queries through our social media and through the 2 different professional platforms to have something along this topic about specifically groundwater and water use licensing. So I'm very happy on our behalf that we have 5 ladies who will present to you all aspects of this process, and I myself also really looking forward to this. And then at the end, I will hand over to the current secretary and the past president of the IAH-SA Chapter, Julian Conrad, who will facilitate a question and answer session and a bit of a discussion. So just some house rules. We have 5 talks to work through, and there's quite a bit of planning that went into the program. So we would like the program to flow in the sequence that we placed out here. So we ask that you use the chat function to pose your questions. We have people in the background who will be thanked afterwards who will coordinate the questions and responses so that Julian can facilitate that into a fruitful discussion right at the end. So we will limit the questions in between. We won't have any response time, but post your question, and in the end, we promise to get back to you on all your questions from the questionnaire and as you are posting them during the session. Also use the chat box for attendance, please. So type your name and affiliation there, especially for the sake of CPD points. Questions in the chat for the end, and please ensure that your microphone and cameras are switched off. Okay. So once again, welcome. I'm very happy to have you all here. We're going to start now while our first speaker uploads. So you will see we try to alternate the program a bit. So the first speaker is Melissa Lintnaar-Strauss from the Department of Water and Sanitation. And yes, I hope you enjoy her talk. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Matthys. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to give you some insights into why it is important for you to apply for an authorization. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I thought it's important to just make sure you understand what the department's role and functions are. First of all, the department is responsible for water resource management throughout the Republic of South Africa. We have to manage all the water resources. That includes the rivers, the estuaries, although it's a shared responsibility with the Department of Environmental Affairs. It includes wetlands as well as groundwater. The department implements 2 acts. The one is the National Water Act, and the National Water Act specifically deals with the regulation of the water from the resource to bulk water users, and our bulk water users are typically our local authorities, our water user associations, our mines. Then the department also has to regulate the Water Services Act, and the Water Services Act deals with the provision of water services from the water service provider, which is the local authorities, to us as customers. The department is in the process of moving the National Water Act and the Water Services Act into one single act, because sanitation is also now a part of our responsibility. And something that I want to draw your attention to at this stage already is the guiding principles for the National Water Act is sustainability and equity. Just in terms of how the water resources are used in South Africa, the bulk of the water goes for irrigation purposes. The figure is now about at 61%. Urban water users also take up a big chunk of the water use, and our cities are getting bigger. Rural water use about 5%, mining about 3%, industrial use outside the local authorities about 3%, power generation and afforestation. Very important to understand how the department allocates water. If we look at the total water resources in South Africa, the first priority for the department is to make water available for the reserve. The reserve is water for our aquatic ecosystems, the plants and animals that needs that water for their survival, and also for what we call basic human needs. Basic human needs is 25 liters per person per day. And those, I like to stress at this stage, is the only water users that has a right to water. After provision has been made for the reserve, we have to allocate the other available water resources. The next important groups that we have to look at is international obligations. The Republic shares a couple of water resources with other countries, and we have to make sure that the other countries have their fair share of water, and that water is acceptable in terms of quantity as well as quality. We have to cater for our strategic water users, and that would typically be Eskom that provides electricity, and Sasol, for instance. Then we also have to make sure that there is water available for what we call interbasin transfers. And we also have to make sure that water is available for future use. And the water resources in this area refers to big water users that, or the water users that takes place in bulk, and that refers to water resource management that is done at a macro scale in our planning offices in Pretoria. Then we come to what we call the allocation by the catchment management agencies or the regional offices, where the agencies are not established yet, and they have to work according to what we call a water allocation plan. And the water that we're going to speak about this afternoon refers to water that is available through the water allocation plan, where we have to look at water use authorizations. Then we also need to take into account that we have what we call existing lawful use. And once we allocate the water, there's a number of different aspects we take into account. We have to redress past discrimination, socioeconomic impacts, previous investment, strategic importance. And you will probably see that we're moving on to, again, to make sure the equity principle is being applied to. In terms of permissible water use, you can use water under one of the following conditions. If the water use is permissible under what we call Schedule 1 water use, if it is an existing lawful use, if the water use is permissible under a general authorization, or if you have to apply for a license, or if the department has dispensed with the license requirement. In terms of Schedule 1 water use, this is very small water uses. You do not have to apply to the department to exercise this water use. And this is typically reasonable domestic water use with it. And I want to specify reasonable is the operative word here. Small gardening activities, if you want to water your garden, if you are out farm in the Karoo and you need to give water to your animals so that we can have the nice Karoo lamb choppies, that type of water would also fall under the Schedule 1 water use. Or if you collect water from your roof, rainwater harvesting, that falls under Schedule 1. or emergency situations, for instance, firefighting purposes, water has to be available for that, and for recreational purposes. Please note, for recreational purpose, you need to have lawful access to the water before you can just go and use it for recreational purposes. Then stormwater that we find in our local authorities, that would also fall under Schedule 1 water use. In terms of existing lawful uses, existing lawful use refers to water use that has already taken place 2 years before the commencement of the National Water Act, and if the water use was already authorized under another law before the Act came into act, or it has been declared as an existing lawful use, and the Section 33 of the National Water Act describes this process. The qualifying period for abstraction of groundwater started in 1 October 1996 to September 1998, and for surface water is 1 October 1997 to September 1999. General authorizations. General authorizations is an authorization that contains all the conditions that you have to comply for. It's normally for water users that's not going to have a very big impact on the water resource, but you still have to complete registration forms, and the department has to confirm that you do comply with the general authorizations. Therefore, we have general authorizations for different types of water uses. We have one for what we call abstraction water, or water uses for abstraction and storage. We've got water use authorizations for non-consumptive uses, what we call our Section 21C and I water uses. And we've got general authorizations for our water quality related water uses. But just to give you a better indication, when we talk about the water users and water uses, the big water user groups that we work with is agriculture, we work with industry, recreational water use, domestic water use, and the aquatic ecosystem, like I mentioned previously. I think in terms of groundwater, the important water uses that is of specific relevance to you is taking water from a water resource. When you typically abstract groundwater, some of that water could be stored in a dam, and that would be storage of the water. Also things like engaging in a controlled activity that falls under Section 21E. The one we normally work with is irrigation with wastewater, but something especially for groundwater, that's going to become more prominent in future is the intentional recharge of an aquifer. And then your water quality related groundwater uses would be Section 21G, where you dispose of waste in a manner which will have a detrimental impact on the water resources. And here we look specifically at the big tailings facilities or big wastewater dams. You're also looking at removing or discharging of wastewater found, or disposing of water found underground, typically associated with your mining activities, and it could also be Section 21H, which deals with water that's heated up in some sort of activity. Then I thought it's just important to make you aware that for the Western Cape and in some of our other water management areas, resource quality objectives have been determined, and this is an important aspect that we will look at in future. The resource quality objective is basically standards that we've set, or we should call them objectives because we haven't reached those standards yet, but to make sure that the water use is sustainable, we look at our different water uses and have different parameters to see what is the impact on our environment specifically. Just to give you an example of the resource quality objectives that have been determined for the Berg water management area, here you can see this is specifically for groundwater, the recommended classes that we have, and we have noted the ecological categories. Very important, if you're going to apply for a license, please have the pre-application meeting. It is quite important that you very early on in the process determine or ensure you know what water uses are triggered. You might think that only 1 or 2 water uses are triggered, but in many cases there might be other uses. For instance, if you're going to abstract water and it's close to within a regulated area of a wetland, or you're very close to the river, we have to check if you're not going to have additional impacts and additional water. There will be additional water requirements. Please make sure that the application forms is completed and it is correct. If the information is not correct and completed, it does lead to delays in the application. Then there is always additional information that's required as part of the water use application. Please remember that a water use is linked to a specific property. Therefore, title deeds are extremely important. If we have to ask, we normally ask you for your ID, that's important. You have to pay the license fees. It's really very cheap. It's 100 Rand plus VAT. So it's very cheaper than some of what the other payment options are. When you apply for an authorization from the department, there are other processes, like the EIA, land use applications, mining applications. Please make sure that when you start with those processes that you also speak to the department in time to apply for your license. We often find that all the other processes are completed and the license process is an afterthought. Also, please remember, I've mentioned in the beginning that one of the important aspects we have to consider is sustainability. Therefore, reserves are part of our applications and we have to consider them. Equally, the equity principle, the Section 20 motivations that I have already mentioned. Okay, so now you have your license or your general authorization. Once you have the document, please read it. We know you're very happy to have the document in your hand, but please read it, because in all our general authorizations and our licenses, there will be monitoring requirements. Typical water requirements that we look at for groundwater are water levels, water quality monitoring, reporting of pollution incidents. Also, our regulation units, both in our CMA and in our regional offices, they have to do inspections on the conditions of the authorization, and they do. And once we see that there is non-compliance with our license conditions, or there's negligence with the conditions, we call in the enforcement team, or popularly known as our blue scorpions in our catchment management agencies or our regional offices. And that is all. Hopefully that helped to make sure that you don't feel this the next time you deal with the department. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So we will continue directly. We are recording all your questions. I would just like to reiterate, please, that you use the chat for your attendance. It's very important to put your name, surname, and affiliation there so that we can link you. And all questions will be addressed at the end during a facilitated discussion. And lastly, also, please switch off your microphones and your videos. Just check that you are switched off with the microphone and the video. So thank you, Melissa, from the Department of Water and Sanitation. Up next from GEOSS, we have Jodie Coetzee. So while Jodie is uploading, type your names, and thank you so much, Jodie.
Great stuff. Good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, thanks so much for being present. And yeah, I'm Jodie Coetzee, and I oversee the Water Use License Applications Business Unit at GEOSS South Africa. I'm super excited to delve into a few key topics with you all this afternoon. Some of these topics include who water belongs to, cooperative governance between national and local government in South Africa, how long it takes to obtain authorization for groundwater use, that is to receive your license from the Department of Water and Sanitation, the public participation process, and the all-important Section 27 motivational report, which Melissa has also touched on. Right, so firstly, before we delve deeper into this, we need to demystify a perception that exists, that if you have a borehole on your property, whether it's a farm, a residential property, a factory, a business park, or any other industrial or commercial property, that because you own that property, you own the groundwater that that borehole or wild point might yield. So although the property and the borehole itself might belong to you, and we know that drilling a borehole is a very expensive exercise, so although that belongs to you or the company that you work for, water is a shared finite resource. This said, our constitution, this Constitution of South Africa, guarantees the right of all South Africans to clean and safe drinking water or water. So since water resources are finite, they need to be managed in such a way that all South Africans have access to water and that no one person or entity is able to use water at the expense of another. So to clarify whether anyone deserves a license, the answer is unfortunately no. One is not simply entitled to a license because they've bought a property on which a borehole is located or because they've drilled a borehole. Abstraction from a borehole is tapping into an underground water resource, which is not confined to the boundaries of that property. Therefore, if you want to use groundwater, you would need to register the use or apply for a water use license in order to use it for the specific water users that Melissa mentioned. Now, this is an illustration of the food, water, energy nexus, which is a tool that describes how interconnected these sectors are. And we are well aware that all three are necessary for human well-being as well as sustainable development. This is especially true in a global context where there's a rising population and there's increased movement of people, as well as a demand on basic services and an overall desire to improve standards of living. So therefore, these three sectors, food, energy, and water, need to be carefully managed so that sustainable development is possible. Now, water is the most abundant of these, but it is also the most exploited. And this is where water governance is so vital and where careful consideration needs to be given to who gets what, when they get it, how they get it, and who has the right to water. So there's an overarching need to prioritize human and natural life, to protect and to conserve water resources, which requires adequate governance and management. Now, the Department of Water and Sanitation has its legislative requirements around the use of water, which is guided by the National Water Act of 1998, which Melissa has mentioned. So as consultants, we engage with this piece of legislation on a daily basis when we are called by clients and engaging with prospective water users so that we can best advise them. Now, according to this act, the government, the national government of South Africa, is the public trustee of the nation's water resources and therefore needs to ensure that water, including groundwater, is protected and used and developed, conserved, managed in the most sustainable and equitable manner possible, so that it is used in such a way that all South Africans can benefit from it, as is in line with the Constitution. So prior to 1998, the Water Act of 1956 was in effect. And this act allowed for private ownership of groundwater and granted what was called riparian water rights or riparian rights. These were held by those who possessed land alongside water resources and is now linked to what is known as existing lawful uses. It's important at this point to point out that and to note that this previous act limited the use of boreholes on a specific property and allowed the use of the groundwater on another property only if that water user had a permit. So if this requirement has been fulfilled, only then may a water use be claimed as an existing lawful use under the Act, this new Act of 1998. Now, cooperative governance. So we know that the Department of Water and Sanitation is the ministerial arm of government that has been mandated with the task of governing water use across the country. This said, we also need to acknowledge and understand that there is an overlap with provincial and local government as well, as these arms of government have also been mandated to ensure sustainable use of water. Therefore, we need to understand and be aware that it's not only the Department of Water and Sanitation that has legislative requirements, but that municipalities do as well. We need to be aware of the bylaws that govern certain municipal districts. These need to be adhered to and considered when you are registering your water use or applying for a license with the Department of Water and Sanitation. So bylaws, what are bylaws? Bylaws are laws that are adopted by the council of a municipality to regulate the affairs and services within that specific municipality's jurisdiction. Now, it is our constitution that actually grants these municipalities the power to adopt bylaws. So Melissa's also referred to the National Water Services Act, and this is a piece of legislation. It's of 1997, so 1 year prior to the current National Water Act. So the Water Services Act regulates institutions that manage the access and delivery of water services. And such institutions include your water services authorities, such as your municipalities, water services providers, water services intermediaries, as well as water boards and water services committees. Now, this specific act also recognizes that cooperative governance is crucial in efforts to provide water supply and sanitation services. Therefore, we see that there is an overall institutional structure which includes national and provincial and local government that manages the water services landscape. So this is an illustration from a local municipality's website, which describes the activities that qualify a water user or an entity as a water services intermediary, and also stipulates the process that needs to be followed in order for that user to enter into an agreement with the municipality to act as a water services intermediary. Now, the golden question of how long it takes to obtain your water use license. So before you embark on the process, you need to understand that the process of successfully registering a water use or obtaining a license does take time. And we get these questions often at the start of the process. How long will it take to get my license? Because everybody is eager to start their water use. So bearing all of this in mind, the department has described the water use license application process as a 300-day long process. And the illustration on the slide lays out the various phases of both application as well as assessment. And every applicant needs to bear in mind that your 300 days won't start once you link yourself as a client, but that the clock starts counting once your application has been submitted in full, as there's a whole assessment process that it needs to undergo. The latest time frame that has been suggested for the process is in President Ramaphosa's announcement of a 90-day process in February this year. However, this has not been gazetted as yet. Also very important to note is that there are various factors that play throughout the application and assessment phases, which could very well cause delays on the targeted time frames that you initially went into this process with. Next, the public participation process. So the public participation process is a requirement of the water use license application process, and the department will require that every applicant undertakes this task. Now, as consultants and from our experience, we have found that this has been an extremely useful exercise in terms of getting the applicants to engage with members of the public, especially their neighbours, so that any concerns or issues around groundwater use can be brought to light and discussed. Now, as the name suggests, the process invites members of the public to comment on or to contest a proposed water use. And the process often involves putting a notice up at the site, engaging with neighbouring groundwater users within a set radius in the area, and often publishing a notice in the local newspaper. Again, water is a shared finite resource. Therefore, the department needs to be aware of any issues that exist or any concerns that the public might have regarding a proposed water use before they decide to approve a license. Now, our company has attended many meetings in various different areas where there might be dissent amongst property owners. And we found that engaging on a scientific level and really understanding the true impact of groundwater use has been extremely beneficial to both the applicant and their neighbours or any affected parties. So at this point, I'd like to emphasize that if you are going to submit a water use license application or you are going to oppose a proposed water use, then you need to make sure that your own water affairs are in order. There's no, one can't oppose a proposed water use if one's own water affairs are not in order, or if your own water use is not authorized. Then moving on to the famous Section 27 motivational report, which is another another requirement that applicants need to prioritize throughout the process. And as the name stipulates, it really is a motivational report. And what happens during the process of assessment of an application is that the case officer will present this report to what they call the WUAC. Now, WUAC stands for Water User Authorization Assessment Advisory Committee. So, that committee will basically recommend the application for further assessment that it can go to the head office. So it is a very important part of the application process. Now, Section 27 of the National Water Act addresses various non-scientific aspects related to a proposed water use. When the department is authorizing a water use, it is basically granting a person power to use water, and therefore it needs to know that this power that is being granted to use the water will be done so in such a way that it'll benefit not only the applicant but also others, and that it will be used responsibly. So applicants may, in this section, they may list their contributions towards skills development and training, their non-discrimination policies, efforts that they make to empower non-whites and women, to really assure the department of how they will use the water in the public interest and efficiently, and also to really assure the department of how they will use the water in the public interest and efficiently, and also to really assure the department of how they will use the water in the public interest and efficiently, and various other aspects. So we have found that when an applicant fails to give attention to this report, that the department will simply send it back for revision and pose to us, and say this motivation is not strong enough. And I need to emphasize at this point that saying that the water use is required for times of drought is unfortunately not the only motivation that can be used. One also needs to consider the importance of the water use for the entity, for people, and for the broader community. So when you are submitting your application, you need to consider the existing lawful uses. You need to stipulate how past racial and gender discrimination is being addressed. You need to motivate how you are efficiently and beneficially going to use that water should your application be successful. You need to outline the socioeconomic impact of obtaining the water use license. You need to describe the catchment management strategy. You need to emphasize the effect that it will have on the water resource. You need to motivate by including the investments that you've already made with regards to developing the infrastructure. The department will consider the investments already made. And then there's also, what is the strategic importance of the water use? And what is the quality? Has a reserve determination been done? And what have the results of this been? And you also need to indicate the duration of the undertaking you plan to take. So, just to emphasize is that just like land is an issue, water also needs to be shared equally. So in closing, your water isn't only yours, and if you have an authorization to use groundwater, you also have a responsibility to manage and use that groundwater responsibly. Further, we all need to understand that managing water services is an extremely complex process, which involves different institutions working together in a coordinated manner. Remember that you need to comply with both local and national government legislative requirements and comply with your license conditions, as Melissa said. And then lastly, when you undertake this process, please don't neglect the public participation process nor the Section 27 motivation. Thank you so much for your time, and that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Jodie. So while our next presenter is uploading, please remember once again your attendance in the chat. And yes, we will address all your questions that we are following on the chat after all the presentations are done. So you will get feedback on everything. Okay, so our next speaker is Cain from GCS, number 3 of 5. And I'm very happy to see all the engagement from the audience. Thank you for this. Thank you, Kate.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for your time today. My name is Cain.
The company.
I work for GCS.
Yeah, that one I did.
Sorry, can we just switch all our microphones off, please? Thank you. So I work for GCS Consulting and I manage the water use authorization unit. Once we've determined that you do need a water use license, what is the process and how do you authorize this water use? The Department of Water and Sanitation previously used to accept hard copies of water use license applications. This has been developed over the years, and there's now an online system which is called EWULAS, which stands for the Electronic Water Use License Application and Authorization System. The system's been developed to register your water uses online, so we don't need to print hundreds and hundreds of copies and pages and submit those in hard copy anymore. And the online application system allows for tracking of the application throughout the whole process. So you can see where you are and the department can see where they are, and everybody can be on the same page. So using the online application process is easy. All you need to do is register your water use profile. You log in with your details, and then you can start your online application following the prompts. When you go to the website, this is the page that you will see. You'll see the red circle. That's where you will log in with your email address and your password and get onto the online system. Once you're on the system, there are various steps to take. It's broken up into a 3-step process. The first step is to verify your profile information. So in this step, you need to verify and update your profile and contact information. As Melissa said, this information needs to be accurate and correct. It also includes determining who will be the primary user or signatory on your application. So if you are doing the system yourself as a water user, you would make sure that you would be the signatory. If you are having a consultant do it on your behalf, you need to clarify whether you will be the signatory or whether the consultant can sign off on the application on your behalf. And this needs to be all done up front. If a consultant is doing the application, they will do step 2 and verify the information of themselves and of the client. And then step 3 is where we apply for the actual water use license applications. The process consists of the following steps. First, we get the pre-application inquiry, where this is where you meet with the department to determine the steps going forward and the process. Once this has been submitted and approved, then the process starts with phase 1, which is the application, phase 2, which is the site visit arrangements, and phase 3 is where you upload your technical reports and final assessment can be done by the department. So just to go a bit deeper into the various phases, as I indicated, the pre-application inquiry is where you first engage with the department and notify them of your intent to apply for a water use. This is an extremely important phase of the process. It allows you to make sure that you have all the information and know what you need to do for the process. And it also ensures that the department is aware that you are going to be applying for a water use. As part of this process, the online system allows the department to determine which type of authorization you require to authorize your water use. Is it going to be a water use license? Is it going to be a general authorization? Or can the water use as a Schedule 1 or an existing lawful water use? In order to undertake the pre-application inquiry, you need to inform the department the location of the intended activity. So this is where your title deed comes into play, what farm number, what farm portion, and the coordinates. Also, what volume are you applying for? How much volume of water do you extract from the borehole? And how close are you to the nearest water resource? It's also important to let the department know in which sector you're applying. So is it agriculture or mining or industry or residential developments? They need to know this right up front. And then also the details of the contact person, so that Water Affairs can be in contact with that person and vice versa. Once this pre-application meeting has been done and the way forward has been determined, as well as the license process that will be done, we go to phase 1. On phase 1, we upload the application details based on the meeting, and we include more details regarding the water use. So we need to put in the coordinates of the boreholes that we're applying for, the volumes, and the resource type. So if it's a groundwater abstraction from borehole, or river abstraction would be surface water. This section also requests some administrative documents, and these generally include business registration certificates if you're going to be applying as a business, or ID documents if you're applying as an individual, They also can request the Section 27 motivation, which Jodie spoke about during this phase. Once this phase has been submitted to the department, we go to phase 2 of the online system, and this phase allows for the department to determine if they would like to have a site visit. A site visit is quite important because then the department comes to site and confirms that all the water uses that are triggered are being applied for as part of the application. Not all applications require a site visit. It's a very case-by-case basis. If no site visit is required, phase 2 is skipped and phase 3 is opened on the online system. Phase 3 refers to the technical report and the final assessment. In this phase, this is where the license application forms are completed that Melissa spoke about. It's very important that all the details in the application forms are correct and accurate. This also allows for the uploading of the detailed groundwater investigation report that's done for the borehole abstractions and the sustainable yield. It also allows for the actual technical water use license application report and the Section 27 motivation. Water Affairs can also ask for any other additional information that would have been discussed previously in your pre-application inquiry. Once you've submitted this phase of the project, it then goes to the department for assessment, and they have 137 days, I think, to provide an answer. What is nice on the online system is that you can track the progress and send communication to the department via the online system, and everything is recorded on the same page. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think we've had 3 excellent talks so far, and once again, thank you everyone for keeping the chat alive. While our next presenter uploads, it's Preanna Naicker from GEOSS. A lot of questions asked about the technical report. Here you have it now. So please remember to mute everything, to switch off your cameras, and to do your attendance and your questions in the chat. Thank you, Preanna.
Thank you, Matthys. Just going to start sharing. So thanks, Kate, for that. Very, very informative. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm a hydrogeologist at GEOSS, and I've been involved with WILLARDS for a few years now. So it gives me great pleasure to share with you some of the aspects that I've been exposed to along the way, and some insights I've gained in various studies across various environments in the country. So I just want you to note that the terms geohydrology and hydrogeology are used interchangeably in South Africa. So don't pay too much attention to that. The picture is an actual WULA we submitted for a mining venture, and it's just to give you a sense of how detailed this process can get. So I'm going to run through the following points, but please note that the study itself is quite comprehensive, so I can't include absolutely everything, but I will discuss the most important and noteworthy aspects that will hopefully benefit you. The geohydrological study is a groundwater study, which assesses how sustainable an abstraction is within the surrounding environment and the potential risks associated with it. Most of the studies we complete relate to Section 21A of the National Water Act, which Melissa explained is taking water from a water resource. So South Africa is divided into 9 water management areas, which is shown in yellow. I'm outlining the Berg catchment, as you can see on screen, and those catchments are further subdivided into quaternary sub-catchments shown in green. Now, each of these subcatchments are characterized by a volume of groundwater per hectare of property. So for example, on the right, a property 4.5 hectares in size in quaternary catchment G22H within the Berg catchment may abstract 1,800 cubes without requiring the study. and abstraction above this volume will, of course, require the study. But it's important to note that below this volume, if you plan to use water below this volume that doesn't fall within Schedule 1, then you'll apply for a general authorization. It should also be noted that the abstraction volume, if that abstraction volume is within the GA limit, but the water will be used on another property, it will also require the study. And if the applicant has a large property, thousands of hectares in extent, the maximum extractable volume under a GA is 40,000 cubes per annum. So the reaches of groundwater is not limited to the area below a site, which brings me to the second purpose. It's a dynamic, geologically controlled system. And this means that abstraction nearby can have an impact on the surrounding users and biodiversity. And the significance of this impact is related to the radius of influence. So the illustration on your left shows what we call a cone of depression. At A, you can see a dip in the groundwater level, which also happens at B. And the level drops the lowest closest to the borehole and is shallower further out. However, the cumulative impact of these two abstractions are shown below, where the groundwater table is lowered due to that increase in abstractions. So the same can happen if over-abstraction occurs in an area. And depending on the type of geological setting that you're in, the radius of influence can span kilometers wide. So on the right is a photo of drilling within the Vermaaks Valley in the Cain Karoo outside Elkerine, which is a highly complex structural area. So during our drilling, yield testing, licensing, and even monitoring processes, we had to consider the environment, the presence of springs, as well as baseline data and abstractions that were occurring even before drilling took place. And concerned parties did inquire about this impact that these municipal supply boreholes will have on the ecosystem within the valley. So it's really important to take all of this into account to ensure that the planned abstraction doesn't hinder the environmental setting. And below that are the mountains making up part of the Hex River Valley in the Western Cape, also a structurally complex groundwater area. There were many concerns by neighbors of the applicant that the applicant's water use was dropping the water levels in their boreholes. And it's quite difficult to prove or disprove this without data, of course. So the solution that was proposed was monitoring of all those surrounding boreholes to verify how valid this claim was. Before beginning the study, to assess the use, one would need to first yield test the borehole in line with the national standard, which is the only pump test that the department considers acceptable. Constant head tests, where the borehole is pumped to maintain a constant water level while changing and monitoring the flow rate, are not accepted by the department for licensing groundwater abstraction. So the yield test enables us to see how the water level reacts to different pumping rates, and based on this, a constant rate is selected, usually for 24 hours, but longer if the abstraction is planned for municipal bulk water supply, for example. So after pumping, a sample is taken for quality analysis and water level recovery is monitored. The shorter the recovery time, the better, which means your aquifer is more resilient and bouncing back quicker. So there's a lot that goes into these tests and the scientific analysis that goes along with it. So I can't really walk you through all of that, but I must mention that during yield testing, if there are accessible nearby boreholes, the water levels in those boreholes are monitored to get an idea of that radius of influence we spoke about earlier. And this comes into play when recommending the sustainable maximum pumping rate. So the report consists of some background information on the environmental setting, methodology, and it becomes more detailed and comprehensive at the prevailing groundwater conditions, where the regional and local characteristics of the site are really magnified. And this assesses the type of aquifer, the hydraulic conductivity, groundwater quality, nearby extractions, etc. And some of these aspects, like groundwater modeling, are only required for applications where large-scale abstractions are occurring, and that's where it becomes more appropriate. And similarly, a post-closure management plan may be required in instances where the abstraction is for mine dewatering. The department usually requests this via the license conditions. So the recommendations made in this study are taken into account when the department draws up their license conditions. So these are just the basic aspects included in the study that gives the specialists at DWS an overarching view of the groundwater setting and planned abstraction. I'll now dig into some of the standout aspects that we as hydrogeologists find really important to the application. So when applying for the taking of water, the water balance is crucial. So the water balance tabulates the abstractions monthly, which is governed by the recommended pumping rate. So it goes without saying that you cannot abstract a volume greater than the sustainable pump rate will allow. This is where it gets tricky for many. Rainfall must be taken into consideration if the purpose of that abstraction is for agriculture irrigation. So depending on where in the country your site is located, the abstraction makes provision for rainfall. And the photo on the top was taken at a wine estate in Stellenbosch in autumn, just before the rainy season. And the photo below was during summer when the borehole was used for irrigation. And in this license application, abstraction in the non-rainy seasons were applied for. So this is a typical example of a water balance with the planned usage explained. And in some instances where there are ELUs that are relevant to the property, this also needs to be factored in. So oftentimes applicants may think that they have the right to apply for the maximum sustainable yield of their borehole, but this is simply not true. For irrigation, crop factors have been delineated per crop, per quaternary catchment, as rainfall varies over geographical regions. So the application volume needs to be within the sustainable limits of the aquifer, but also within reason. So for example, for the irrigation of 1 hectare of wine grapes in the Western Cape, approximately 7,450 cubic meters per annum is required. If all you have is 1 hectare to irrigate and your borehole can supply 100,000 cubes per annum, then all you can apply for is the 7,450 cubic meters per annum for irrigation purposes. But one should also consider that some of these crops are dryland crops, so it's important to take all of this into account when drawing up these balances. So simply put, the groundwater resource units, or GRUs, are delineated areas where the bulk of recharge into the aquifer is believed to occur. So for example, where the abstraction occurs in hard rock aquifers, where that fractured rock is exposed to rainfall, is where the aquifer is believed to be being recharged. So it's essentially the source area. So this is an example from the Overberg area in the Cape. The geological setting is complex with various alternating units of sandstones and shales, etc., making up part of the Table Mountain Group aquifer system. And some of these units are better conductors of groundwater than others. So the cross-section on the right shows recharge through these fault zones and into this fractured rock, where eventually that water feeds into the borehole as the supply. From the GRU, we at GEOSS run a quantitative model, which basically gives an estimate of the approximate volume of water within this GRU. So if you'd like more information on the groundwater terminology, I refer you to the link on the right-hand corner, which will take you to the dictionary on the department's website. So taking the available water into account, it's almost always the case that the volume the applicant is applying for is less than this available volume. But what about other users abstracting from this resource? We then look at the WARMS database and consider what all other lawful active users in that area are abstracting. So it gives us a better idea of the true volume available within that GRU. In a simple sense, you can think of the aquifer as a bucket with water coming in when it rains and going out when it's pumped. The storage in the system is in constant flux, and the resource availability is susceptible to a number of factors. It's important to note that aquifers are not a closed system. There are other aspects to consider, like groundwater through flow, urban impact, managed aquifer recharge, etc. So what it really comes down to is ensuring that more water isn't being pumped out than what's coming in. The risk assessment speaks to the impact the abstraction will have on the environment on a local to more regional scale. In most cases, there are two apparent risks to that groundwater, which is groundwater depletion and quality deterioration. So in some cases, abstraction could result in the lowering of water level, fracture dewatering, and insufficient recovery time to a point where it would take years, decades, or longer for that water in the borehole to recover to that original water level. So additionally, the obstruction could draw in poorer quality water from surrounding aquifers into the borehole, which you try to avoid. So for these risks, we propose various mitigation measures, usually revolving around monitoring. So reducing the obstruction either by adjusting the obstruction rate or duration of obstruction, and then also water level monitoring, quality monitoring, and also obstruction volume monitoring. So onto other aspects. No study is without its uncertainties. And although there are basic principles that govern the groundwater flow, delineation of this flow is still subjective without further supporting data like isotope studies to pinpoint exactly where that recharge is coming from. So in the cross-section, we see unconsolidated alluvial material overlying a fractured rock area, which some may include in the GRU on the basis that rainfall percolates through this unit and into that fractured rock aquifer. However, some units have a significant degree of weathering, like in this case, and that weathered clay material acts as a barrier to water flow, which diverts the GRU. So I must once again stress the point that aquifers are not a closed system. So it's still groundwater through flow and urban impact that you always need to keep considering. And in addition, if the WARMS database is not accurately updated and accessible, it also leads to inaccuracies in calculating that available volume of water within your GRU. So boreholes drilled close to rivers that are not cased off at shallower depths run the risk of abstracting from that river. And this could have severe impacts on river systems as well as on downstream surface water users. So the main reason why it becomes an issue during licensing is because of that surface water groundwater interaction. So during our yield testing, there may be signs of a constant head boundary, which alludes to recharge from a river, for example. And if this is seen in the testing data, then inorganic chemistry and stable isotope analysis can be done. However, if it's not apparent, it may go unnoticed. So although the test follows scientific methodology, it can't 100% predict the rate determined during a 48-hour test will always be sustainable through the borehole's lifetime. And this is where monitoring comes in. So the recommended rates are also conservative. So it takes into account the possibility of no rainfall for periods at a time. And through continuous monitoring, we found that in some cases, licensees and in some farms in the Western Cape, they've been able to increase and optimize their pumping rates as their water levels proved stable over long periods of time with those abstractions. So the geohydrological study is not only relevant to Section 21A of the Water Act, but also Section 21G and E, which is disposing of waste in a manner which may detrimentally impact on the water resource and engaging in a controlled activity, respectively. In this case, the report has a great focus on the risk of groundwater contamination, and it considers the different mitigation measures appropriate to the scenario. These photographs are from a study our team did in the Western Plain Karoo region, where the applicant, who's a food manufacturer, planned to irrigate with wastewater as well as dispose of wastewater into a wastewater treatment plant and oxidation pond. So although the study found that the risk of potential contamination to the fractured aquifer is considered to be low, there was potential for seepage towards a nearby river should excessive irrigation occur. And groundwater monitoring in the shallow primary aquifer was recommended. So once this report is complete, it gets submitted to DWS in phase 3 of the WULA, as Kate mentioned earlier. And in the past, it used to look like the picture on your right, with hard copies sent to the regional office. But nowadays, it looks more like this in the bottom, which we and the environment, I'm sure, are quite pleased about. So if the license is awarded, then most of the compliance conditions will relate to appropriate monitoring. The illustration depicts some of the requirements a license typically calls for, which is a flow meter, sampling tap, observation pipe, logger to measure the obstruction volume, water quality, water level, respectively. So this picture is of an equipped borehole in the sandveld that we use for monitoring purposes. which is just a real life representation of this illustration. So these are snippets from a license that speaks to monitoring. There's a lot of emphasis placed on it to ensure that the resource is being used sustainably. And sometimes, in some cases, monitoring boreholes are compulsory, which are shown when the license comes out. These are further monitoring compliance conditions from the very same license. And these compliance conditions are assessed in the form of license audits, internal and external, that are periodically meant to be sent to the department for analysis. So groundwater is a resource that you cannot physically see and easily quantify, which definitely adds to the level of complexity in the study. But using logic and other tools like monitoring, it really aids decision making. So thank you for listening to my talk, and I encourage you to continue questions in the chat box, and I will, chat at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Preanna. For number 4 talk done now. We have one left for you from Elkerine Rossouw from the GWD GCMA. So while Elkerine is uploading, I remind you, please keep the chat going, do your attendance in the chat box, and Julian will, on behalf of all the speakers, address all your questions that we are busy looking at in the chat. Thank you, Elkerine.
Sorry. So thank you very much for listening to me today. My name is Elkerine, and I'm speaking to you about the ins and outs from a licensing perspective. The licensing on e-VULAs is basically my talk. So I hope you enjoy and you find some interesting facts that you didn't know before. So as Preanna and Melissa and everybody stated before, we previously had an old licensing process where we used hard copy forms instead of the online process. But this caused letters to get missing, emails to get not received, and there was just general miscommunication between applicants and the department. From an assessor's point of view, we had 2 separate committees. So we had an internal regional VUAC where we sat and we discussed and deliberated around licenses. And then once that committee agreed on recommendation of a license, we then traveled all the way to Pretoria to go and recommend this license to a national licensing committee. The licensing committee then would then recommend it for the regional head for signature back to Cape Town in our case, and then back to Pretoria again for the DG's or the delegated authority signature. In the meanwhile, we now have this e-VULA process, as Preanna and Kate has alluded to, and it actually works quite well for us as assessors because it keeps you on your toes if you know how it works. We only have one committee, so on which there's 2 representatives from the national head office that looks at our presentations, and also this helps with the recommendation to the national office. Everything is signed off electronically, and then which means that the formats of the letters and the licenses and everything is basically already predetermined, and we don't have to go back and change these things again. As stated, it is a 3-phased approach with an initial identification part, who it is and what it is that you want to do. Then it's followed by a pre-VULA discussion. You can have this discussion online for a lot of these licenses. It's not necessarily a specialized or a site visit at the beginning of the license application. It can, however, sometimes become very difficult if your application is is a bit more comprehensive, and then one would require a site visit. The specialized site visit is done in the third phase, where all the required specialists are supposed to come and visit the site to have their inputs prior to the final documentations. The nice thing about this eVULAS is that there's communication with the applicant from the eVULA process in itself. So you as an applicant can at all times visit your application and see where it is, whether it's with the national office or whether it's in the assessor or whether it's back with you for your own work to be done on. We can now also, from an assessor's point of view, all our reserve requests and our specialist comments are done online, and they do have a limited time frame to respond, which they are reminded of by means of emails regularly to those specialists. There's a quality check done before we present to the VOAC, and this helps with minimizing the comebacks from VOAC. The record of recommendation and the licensing templates are all available online, which helps even a new assessor to have a bit of a more of a streamlined process. Challenges: a system is a system, it's a computer, so there's always some challenges. So the system can be a bit slow during the day. Myself, I decide to work in early morning hours or late in the afternoon when the system is a bit quicker, and when I advise clients, I always tell them that you can rather upload your documents at night if you want to spend time. Unfortunately for consultants, that's not always so nice to hear, because that means out of time. When you have your water use and your water use and your property information changes, we could previously just, take out the piece of paper from the bundle of papers, throw it in the dustbin and add a new one. Unfortunately, with eVULAS, it's not that easy. It means now that we have to stop the process, phone the programmers, ask the programmers to open it, the first phase, let you go back to the first phase, then back to the fourth phase, and it's up and down between phases. And I know that most of the assessors these days, just if the information is incomplete or not correct at the time when they want to start drafting the RRR, they will just decline the license and let you start from scratch with the correct information. Although our specialists are reminded on a frequent basis to give comments to the VOAC assessors, it is so that they are under extreme stresses, and they don't always have the time, and so the comments are not always on time, and this can make the assessment time a little bit longer. The online system also presents an opportunity for many people to just apply for a license without thinking through exactly what they want to apply for, which means that they change their minds halfway through, and that provides us as assessors with problems, because then we're back to the up and down and in between. And unfortunately, the allowance in time and weekly state does not allow for that to extend the period. So if you're in your phase where you have to give in your information on 104 days, and you give us your information on day 104, and we now have 30 days to assess, and then there's new information, it means that we will have to extend that days to incorporate new information, and that was not the idea behind the scheduled and gazetted information. There's different views on the Section 27 importance, and I know that this with applicants sometimes presents a problem. There is still no formal requirement, but each application is actually assessed on its own merits, and that's how it's supposed to be. Because each water use is special in its own. You cannot really pull between two applications and say that they are the same. A detailed assessment of the information is done at the end of the assessment to make sure that all the information is there and correct and relevant before continuing to the next phase. So how can you help to ease the pain for the assessors on the other side? Make sure that you know the following. Make sure that you know exactly where you want to go and take your water. What is the resource type that you want to do? Is it a borehole? Is it a fountain? Is it surface runoff? Is it a stream? How much water are you planning to do? And then the most important part about this how much question is, what is your existing lawful use? In other words, what was your water use before the qualifying period? And did you use it lawfully? So that you can add that or consider that during your intended use. At what rate would you like to have this water supplied to you? In groundwater use licenses, we frequently limit the rate of abstraction as well as the period of abstraction, just to make sure that we don't have an over abstraction of those sites. What do you want to use the water for? Sometimes people just want to abstract water for the sake of abstraction, but it's important to understand your crop requirement, the season of your crop, and exactly even the soil types that you are using for your crop will determine the volumes of water that we would like to see. And then who could be impacted? This is always the question. The question is, if we over abstract here, how am I impacting on my neighbors? And this is where the public participation comes in. For a lot of our applications, we request that you, by means of letter to your direct neighbors within 1 kilometer or 2 kilometer radius, just ask for their input and let them know that what your plans are. That makes phone calls to the department of borehole machines being or drills seen at my neighbor's property much easier to answer. Make sure that you have the correct details of your property uploaded. I cannot stress this enough. The amount of licenses that has come back that we had to redo because when we do the integration between the two systems, the information on Windeed, on the land base is not the same as what you have supplied to the assessor. And then it makes this license go back and repeat the whole scenario all over again. And if you are applying as a going concern, in other words, if you're applying as a farming practice on a neighbor's farm or on your own farm, but as the PTY Limited, then you will need to have all the agreements in place and as part of your initial upload. And it's important to also state this in the beginning. Water is licensed to a property, and we will need to make sure that the property owner supports your application. Specialist reports, I'm sure Preanna has already got you thinking about your way forward in terms of your specialist report, but just make sure that if you are working in a regulatory zone, in other words, within 100 meters of a water course or 100-year flood line or 500 meters from a wetland, that you do have a specialist opinion about whether you're going to have an impact on that surface water, and that is included in your license application. And then I always say draft your own Section 27 before you give it to your consultant, so that you know what you are reporting in terms of your, now all these little things on my screen is EPVs, International Producers of Wine, CSA Global Gap, Eurogap, all those things that you already belong to. Make sure that you add these to your Section 27. It's important for us to understand that you're already doing what you can in terms of your social and economic responsibilities. So back to licensing. So this is what you're going to put in. You're going to put in your title, your name, and all the information that Kate and Melissa has spoken about. And you're going to, and once you've done this on eVulas, this is pretty much what I see. I see the summary of the application, and this is the first and only information that I have to make a decision on whether this is going to be a license or a general authorization or a Schedule 1 use. So it's important that when you put in the application, the summary of the application, that the more detail you can give, the better. As you know, that the various quaternary catchments have their own water requirements or short, some areas are water shortage areas. So the more information that you can provide under the summary of application, the better for us as assessors to actually make an informed decision. It's important to note that you must put in type of application as a new registration, as the licensing integration process will not continue between the EWULAS process and the water allocation resource management system WARMS if it's not completed online. So it's also important to explain to us if there's a water for new development or if it's just for sustainability. Sometimes, especially with groundwater in the Western Cape, the water is not used for new development, but just to support during dry seasons or during summer or during the drier drought conditions. It's important to use the correct region and correct water management area. So please use the drop-down lists. Make sure to find the correct areas and sectors, as these will also guide you to the right catchment management agency or proto-catchment management agency to handle your license process. When you're using the map, there's a couple of things that in EWULAS that's quite nice in using the map, is that they automatically generate the GPS coordinates. But the first of these little blockies in the screen is where you actually need to put down your water use abstraction or water use place of water use. And the second one is the place of interest. That's where you will be irrigating. In many cases, especially groundwater and surface water, water can be taken on another property and then transferred. Transfer is not the right word. And then reticulated to another property. So taking by means of a pump on the one side, then through a pipe to another property. The place of abstraction is the 21A. It's not where you're going to irrigate. And that is just the difference between the water use. The next slide just shows you what it looks like from our side. So you're going to put in your form the type of the resources and so on. And these are then typically what it would look on our side to see what information has been uploaded. And these are linked then to the old traditional forms. The traditional forms would look more or less like the bottom blockie. And if you put in the client registration information, it should pull through to the other local property informations and details. The administrative documents that is required, and that will not even go past the administrative or the admin process, which is the first person that looks at your application, is your proof of payment, your certified copy of your ID. If you're a consultant, then you would require to also upload a letter of appointment, a copy of your company registration number, and the optional or the section 27 proof of motivational report. So once we've done all this and we've drafted our 27-page executive summary of all the information that you guys have submitted or the applicant has submitted, and we're lucky, then you will get a license. And I've placed a copy of a license that I've received this year. It was signed on Christmas Eve in December. But every license, as stated, by Melissa is important to read through, because typing errors do happen. We are still just people doing a capturing of data. And once you've received the licenses, it's important to read through the licenses. The first, one of the first general licenses conditions that you will see is that you are responsible for all charges, that you are not allowed to, that you have to inform us the moment that you subdivide or change your property details, or even change your name. If you decide to go from a CC to a PTY Limited or to a trust, it's important to change that because the legal document needs to be adjusted. It's important to know that that the department does not accept liability for any damage, loss, or inconvenience, whether from nature or because of shortage of water or inundation or flood, etc. And that is one of the conditions in a license. So yes, license conditions, we do actually audit them. We have a CME unit, which is the Control, Monitoring and Enforcement Unit, that do from time to time do site visits or farm visits in the Western Cape. They have had, due to the drought, we've had several blitzes where we have entered onto properties together with the Department of Environmental Affairs, as well as other departments like agriculture, to ensure that all license conditions are complied to and that all water uses and environmental uses are authorized. This is typically the things that we look at. We look at the quantity of the water that was authorized and to see if it was metered as required. We look at the measuring devices and whether they are in a good state and whether they've been maintained. So the licensee is required to keep some of these informations on hand, and some of the information is posted to the regulation department, either the CMA or the DWS offices on a regular basis. One of the many conditions that's also included is that the volume may be reduced when the license is reviewed. So especially in groundwater, because of the nature of groundwater licensing, it might be that new information come to the front and you need to then review the volume of water if the pump tests are not all up to speed or if there was something that happened in that year. Another thing that has been discussed is the reserve request. A lot of the reserves are done by desktop and is not a high quality reserve. But with the recent resource quality objectives, a lot of these areas can now be prioritized and higher quality reserves may be done in due course. And these can cause a change in license volumes for those areas where the reserves are undertaken and in a more detailed form. And that is about all the licensing ins and outs that I could think of and that I wanted to just share with you as a group. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Secretary of the IAH, I've been tasked to facilitate the Q&A session, but firstly, I really want to thank the presenters. Thank you very much for volunteering. Thank you very much for the time and effort you put into the preparation for this afternoon. It comes with quite a lot of pressure. And thank you for the excellent presentations. Regarding Q&A, Matthys did say that we'll address all questions, but we certainly can't do that now. And we're essentially out of time. So I would like to propose, we've had a team here collating all the questions and we've tried to compile answers. And so we will compile a document of selected slides and then questions and answers that we will distribute to those who've attended this afternoon, as well as we'll put up an FAQ list on our websites so that you could refer back to those to see if you've got answers to your questions. But it's been overwhelming, the attendance as well as the number of questions. So we just can't deal with those all this afternoon. I would just like to ask that we take about 5 minutes. We've compiled a couple of key questions, and I think they're important to answer. And the first one I would just like to address to Melissa. And if you could just bear with me for 5 minutes, I think that's how long we're going to go on. We've got at least 21 questions prepared that we've clustered from this afternoon, but let's just work on this for about 5 minutes. Melissa, you mentioned the importance of the pre-application meeting. Is it a legal requirement? I've requested pre-application meetings before with officials from the department, and the official said it was not needed. What about the current restrictions? Are officials willing to meet via online platforms? Melissa, over to you.
Julian, I just want to indicate the department is fully up and running as far as the license applications are concerned. Officials are willing to go out and do site visits if they have to. The officer working with your application will indicate, it depends on the type of application that we're dealing with. If it's a license application and it's complicated, a pre-application meeting will definitely be asked for. If it's a simple application that we know what's going on and what the application are, and we are sure about the type of water uses that you want information on, you will be guided by the specific person that works with that application. But the department is certainly open for business. We are receiving requests throughout this period to assess applications. Thank you.
All right, the next one being the President in his address mentioned that the IWIL process will now take 3 months. How practical is that? How far are we from implementing the process? The department does not seem to stick to the legislated timeframes. Many of my applications say, for example, duration day 405 of 300. Can any feedback be provided on that, please? With so many specialist reports required for integrated water use license application, is it possible to reduce processing timelines from 300 to 90 days? And Elkerine, if you've recovered a little bit, could you please address this question?
Okay, so yes, there's a alignment between the NEMA and the National Water Act, and that is why the timeframes is for about 300 days. I can't really speak to the President's address about the 3 months, except that if it's 3 months from the day of having a complete license on your table after all the studies has been done, it's possible. But with so many specialists required, yes, an integrated WULA might take longer than the 300 days, but that is why it is always important to have a good discussion with your assessor beforehand, before embarking on a license, especially for integrated water use license applications.
What are the laws regarding historical use and boreholes not needing a license under that? Melissa, could you tackle that, please?
Julian, that would fall, it could fall under the existing lawful use. And in terms of the existing lawful use, there is a process that the department is currently busy embarking on. We call it the validation and verification process, where we actually have to check whether the water use is lawful. It has been going on in the areas where I work, but I know there is in other parts of the country, they're also embarking on this process, but you can also contact the regional office or the CMA to assist you with that specific issue if you are unsure. Thank you.
Another one for you, Melissa. I'm sure you would like to have a panel of your colleagues with you. What should I do in terms of poor communication from the department and how to deal with it?
When you apply for an authorization, there will be a person that you can speak to. Please just check the communication that you receive from the department. It's normally on top, and there will be a person's contact details and the email addresses. But if you still do not receive any joy, you can always complain to our regional directors or our regional managers, and they will make sure that we do our part. But people can contact the department if we find in a lot of cases that maybe people are speaking to the wrong person, or what I find a lot is that applications are sent to the wrong office. For instance, documents come to us that must go to the BGCMA, but we normally try and assist people in that regard and just make sure that they speak to the correct people. We normally find that once you actually found the correct person you must speak to, things move along quite quickly. But please keep on trying, and we have a license manager specifically in our office that we can give people his contact details. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Melissa. I think let's take one more question, and for Elkerine, is there a volumetric limit to guide Schedule 1 use? That's one question. For Elkerine.
Okay, so I see the three questions on the screen, so I'll try and answer this as I see it. So Schedule 1 is a small volume, a household use for a smallish garden. So when we say small garden, it should be something that's not going to be used for commercial uses. So if you have your own 4 pear trees and an apple tree in the backyard, it is seen as a small garden. So what is a volumetric limit? From the BGCMA's point of view, we look at the lowest volume that can be allocated from within a GA, and that's 2,000 cubic meters per annum. If anything is more than that, then we request a general authorization application as such. In terms of the multiple households for a single borehole on a private property, yes, it's still Schedule 1, but if you're going to use that water for drinking water, then you will need to make sure that you are registered with your water services provider, which is normally your local municipality or district municipality, as a water services provider and not an authority. And there is bylaws and Water Services Act that actually specifically talks to that. So if you are doing that, then you need to also be speaking to your municipality.
Great, thank you, Elkerine. I actually am going to draw it to a close now, if you don't mind. There have been amazing questions on the chat, and as I said, we have listed all of those. We are trying to compile answers. We've been trying to do that through the afternoon, but we will compile a document with slides and the questions and then answers. We'll also try and put this up on our websites on the FAQ as an FAQ. But I would just like to thank all of you this afternoon for attending. It's been really an interesting afternoon. Thank you very much to the speakers. And thank you to those working behind the scenes. It's been Alanda, Minka, Dale, Christelle. And thank you very much. And I would just like to wish everyone well, keep well, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.